Dad perfect events. She handed me a laminated sheet of paper the first time I tried to hold my own grandson. I still remember standing in the doorway of their house in Cranberry Township, a stuffed fire truck tucked under my arm, and my daughter-in-law Beverly sliding that document across their granite kit Beverly Marshall counter like I was signing a lease agreement. No unannounced visits, no bringing food without prior approval, no discussing family finances with Curtis, no taking Tyler anywhere without written consent 48 hours in advance. I read it twice, then looked up at her with what I hoped was a calm expression. Because what else do you do when the woman your son married hands you a contract to govern how you love your grandchild? Just so we're all on the same page, Beverly said, her smile not reaching her eyes. My son Curtis was standing near the back of their kit Beverly Marshall, looking at his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. That was 3 years ago. Tyler was 3 then, and that fire truck I brought him is probably in a donation box somewhere. I never did see him play with it. My name is Stanley Pierce. I'm 65 years old, retired fire captain from Pittsburgh Fire Department after 28 years of service. I also did a tour in Vietnam back when that meant something. I retired when my wife Helen got sick with pancreatic cancer. She passed 3 years ago, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Helen was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family, who kept a handwritten recipe box going back to her own mother, who once drove 2 hours in a January snowstorm to bring soup to a neighbor she barely knew. She loved Curtis fiercely and unconditionally. She adored Tyler from the moment she first held him, 2 weeks before her diagnosis. I can still see her in that hospital chair, Tyler on her lap, reading him Goodnight Moon for what would be the last time. She kept stopping to look at him. Really look at him, like she was memorizing every detail. "Stanley," she whispered to me that day, "this little boy is going to need us to fight for him someday." I thought she was talking about her cancer, about leaving him too early. I didn't know she meant something else entirely. Helen used to say that Tyler was God's way of giving her something beautiful to look at on the way out. She'd sit by the window in our house on Regent Square, Tyler playing with blocks on the living room floor, and she'd just watch him with this peaceful expression. "Look how he concentrates," she'd say. "Look how serious he gets when he's figuring something out. That's your brain in there, Stanley." After she died, I thought the hardest part was going to be the silence in the house. The way her coffee mug stayed in the same spot on the Kit Beverly Marshall counter for 3 weeks because I couldn't bring myself to move it. The way her romance novels sat on her nightstand with bookmarks still in them, stories she'd never finish. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that the family I thought I had was slowly being managed away from me, one laminated rule at a time. It started before Helen even passed. Beverly and Curtis had been married for 5 years at that point, and things had always been a little stiff between Beverly and me, but he'd put it down to personality differences. She was organized, particular, private. I respected that. I gave them space. I didn't drop by unannounced, didn't offer opinions on their choices, didn't interfere. Beverly worked as a compliance officer for a downtown Pittsburgh firm, the kind of place where everything had to be documented in triplicate. She brought that mentality home. Even family dinners felt like board meetings sometimes. She'd have agendas printed out, what we'd eat, what we'd discuss, how long each topic should take. Helen used to joke that Beverly probably had a flowchart for brushing her teeth, but I figured every family needed someone who kept things organized. Helen and I were more the figure it out as we go types. Maybe Curtis needed structure. Maybe that's what attracted him to Beverly in the first place. When they bought their house in Cranberry Township, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac called Maple Ridge Drive, I gave them $45,000 as a gift. It was most of what remained from a small inheritance my father had left me, plus some of my pension savings. The house was beautiful, brick front, big yard, the kind of place where kids could ride bikes in the street without worry. I remember the day we signed the papers. Beverly had spreadsheets showing the mortgage calculations, the property taxes, the estimated maintenance costs for the next 5 years. Everything color-coded and laminated. Curtis just nodded along, signing where she pointed. I was impressed by her thoroughness, honestly. Helen always handled our finances because numbers made my head spin, but Beverly made it look like science. I didn't attach conditions to the $45,000. I didn't ask for anything back. I didn't even want them to feel obligated to invite me over more often. It was family money, and they were family, simple as that. What I didn't know was that $45,000 in Beverly's mind wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. And somewhere along the way, she had assigned me a value, calculated what I was worth to her household, and was quietly running the numbers on how to maximize her return on investment. The signs were subtle at first. After Tyler was born, Helen and I would visit every Sunday after church. We'd bring lunch from the deli on Murray Avenue. Sandwiches, potato salad, those cookies Tyler loved with the rainbow sprinkles. Beverly would smile and accept the food, but I started noticing she'd serve something else instead. "Oh, I already had dinner planned," she'd say, "but thank you." The deli food would disappear into their refrigerator, and we'd never see it again. Then came the comments about Tyler's schedule. "He really does better with consistent nap times," Beverly would say if we arrived 15 minutes early. Or his pediatrician says too much stimulation can be overwhelming for children his age if we brought him a new toy. After Helen died, I tried to be present without being intrusive. I'd call ahead. I'd keep visits to once a week, Sunday afternoons, 2 or 3 hours. I'd bring Tyler little things, a book, a puzzle, a chocolate bar from the shop near my house in Squirrel Hill. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, watching him grow. He had Helen's eyes, this serious gray blue that turned greener in the summer, and he asked questions constantly, the way children do when they're discovering that the world is enormous and full of things nobody has explained yet. "Grandpa Stanley, why do fire trucks have ladders on top? Grandpa Stanley, do fish get cold in the winter? Grandpa Stanley, where do clouds come from?" I loved those questions. Each one reminded me of Helen sitting in her chair, watching him play, predicting he'd have my curiosity and her patience. I'd answer as best I could, sometimes making up stories when the real answers were too complicated for a 4-year-old mind. But every few months, something shifted. The Sunday visits got shorter. Beverly would glance at her watch more often. "Tyler gets cranky if he misses his quiet time," she'd say, even though Tyler seemed perfectly happy building Lego towers with me on their living room carpet. Then came the 48-hour notice requirement. "It just helps me plan better," Beverly explained when she instituted that rule. "You know how I like to have everything organized?" I did know. I started calling every Friday to confirm Sunday visits, marking it on my calendar like a doctor's appointment. Then I was asked not to park in the driveway because it bothered the neighbors. I never understood that one. The Hendersons on one side were elderly and barely left their house, and the young couple on the other side had 3 cars of their own crowding their driveway. But I parked on the street. It wasn't worth arguing about. Then I was told not to bring food anymore because Tyler had dietary sensitivities that I wasn't qualified to navigate. Apparently, red dye number 40 was problematic. So was high fructose corn syrup, and anything with artificial preservatives. I studied food labels like they were fire safety manuals, trying to find snacks that would pass Beverly's inspection, but there was always something wrong. The breaking point came on a gray Sunday in October. I had driven the hour from Squirrel Hill to Cranberry Township, brought a book about construction trucks that I thought Tyler would love, and arrived exactly at 2 p.m. as scheduled. Beverly answered the door in her yoga clothes, phone pressed to her ear. "Oh, Stanley," she said, covering the phone with her hand. "I'm so sorry. Tyler's fighting a little cold, and I think it's better if he rests today. Maybe next week?" Through the window, I could see Tyler in their family room, building something elaborate with his blocks. He looked perfectly healthy to me. He even waved when he saw me. But Beverly was already closing the door with an apologetic smile. I stood on their front porch for 4 minutes, holding that construction truck book, watching my grandson play through the window. Then I walked back to my car and drove an hour home. I mentioned it to Curtis the next time we talked on the phone. "She just wants things to run smoothly," he said. "You know how she is." I did know how she was. What I was beginning to understand was that Curtis had stopped distinguishing between what Beverly wanted and what was right. The rule sheet arrived in my inbox about 8 months after Helen passed. It was a formal document printed on actual letterhead that said Pierce Family Household Guidelines across the top. Beverly had apparently drafted it herself, outlining the terms of my involvement in Tyler's life. Visiting hours, Saturday afternoons only, 2-hour maximum. Gifts required pre-approval with 24-hour notice. No discussion of financial matters with Curtis or Tyler. No photographs shared on social media without written consent. No overnight visits without a minimum of 30 days' notice. No food items brought to the home without ingredient list approval. At the bottom, there was a line that read, "By signing below, I acknowledge that I have read and agree to abide by these guidelines," with a blank line for my signature. I printed out the document and read it 3 times. I carried it around in my pocket for 2 days, pulling it out at random moments. While I was having my morning coffee, while I was watching the evening news, while I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Each time I read it, it felt more surreal. This was my grandson we were talking about, my own flesh and blood. The little boy who ran to the door when I arrived, who asked me to read him stories in my fire captain voice, who called me every Tuesday evening just to tell me what he'd learned in preschool that week. I didn't sign it. Instead, I called Curtis and asked if we could talk in person. He said he'd been meaning to call me too, which should have been my first clue that this conversation had been planned. We met for coffee at the VFW Hall on Route 19, halfway between Pittsburgh and Cranberry Township. Neutral ground, which I suppose tells you everything about where things had gone. The hall was nearly empty on a Wednesday afternoon, just a few old-timers playing cards in the back corner, and the bartender restocking beer bottles. Curtis sat across from me at a wooden table, scarred with decades of coffee rings and cigarette burns. He had the look of a man who has been coached on exactly what to say. His shoulders were tight, his hands folded in front of him like he was in a job interview. "Beverly feels like the boundaries haven't been respected," he told me, his eyes focused on his coffee cup instead of my face. I asked him which boundaries. I had followed every rule she'd given me. I had called ahead, kept my distance, swallowed every instinct I had to just be a grandfather. He talked for a while about Beverly's need for structure, about how unpredictability stressed her out, about how the visits were becoming overwhelming for Tyler, a claim that puzzled me, since Tyler always ran to the door when I arrived and cried when I left. I let him finish. Then I asked him directly, "Do you want me involved in Tyler's life?" He said yes. He said of course. But there's always a but. The but, it turned out, was that Beverly had a new proposal. If I wanted to maintain regular access to Tyler, she felt it was reasonable for me to contribute to Tyler's expenses. Not a gift, not when I felt like it. A standing monthly contribution of $600 transferred directly to an account she controlled, as a condition of continued access to my grandson? She calls it a family support arrangement, Curtis said, not quite meeting my eyes. She's done some research, and apparently it's pretty common for grandparents to help with childcare costs when they want regular visitation time. I looked at my coffee. I looked at him. He was 42 years old, and he was sitting across from a VFW table, explaining to his father that seeing his grandchild would now cost $600 a month. "Research," I said. "What kind of research?" "Legal research," Curtis said, "about grandparents' rights and responsibilities. Beverly thinks it's important that everyone understands their role in Tyler's life." I wondered if Beverly's legal research had included Pennsylvania's actual grandparents' rights laws, or if she'd just found some blog posts that supported whatever conclusion she'd already reached. But I didn't say that. "And what's Tyler's opinion on this arrangement?" I asked. Curtis shifted in his seat. "Tyler doesn't need to know about the financial details. Kids shouldn't be involved in adult decisions." That was Beverly talking, not Curtis. My son had never used the phrase adult decisions in his entire life. Before Beverly, Curtis was the kind of guy who'd explain to a 5-year-old exactly how a car engine worked if the kid asked. Now he was talking about compartmentalizing information like Tyler was a security clearance. I said I needed some time to think. Curtis nodded, like that was a perfectly reasonable response to a perfectly reasonable request. I drove home in the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It's the quiet of a man who is trying very hard not to say some things he can take back. The radio stayed off. The windows stayed up. I needed to hear myself think. I didn't sleep well that night. I sat at the Kit Beverly Marshall table where Helen and I used to have our morning coffee, and I thought about Tyler's gray-blue eyes and the way he said Grandpa Stanley with the emphasis on the Stanley, like my name was the most interesting word he knew. I thought about Helen saying Tyler was God's gift to us on the way out. I thought about $45,000 going into a house that now had a sign-in sheet for family visits. I thought about my grandson growing up believing that love was something you had to pay for, And then I thought about a conversation I'd had about 6 months earlier with my neighbor Joyce, whose son had gone through a difficult divorce. She'd mentioned a lawyer, a family law attorney in Pittsburgh named Nelson Brooks, someone Joyce described as patient and precise, and not the kind of man who gets loud when things get complicated. I had taken his card to be polite. It was still in the drawer with the takeout menus and the spare keys. I took it out that night and set it on the counter next to my coffee mug. I called Nelson Brooks the next morning at 9 a.m. sharp. His assistant put me through within the hour, and I spent 45 minutes on the phone explaining the situation as clearly and calmly as I could. Nelson listened without interrupting, asking only clarifying questions about dates and amounts. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Pierce, I want you to do a few things before we talk next. I want you to save every email, every text, every document Beverly has sent you. I want you to write down, with dates, every visit that was canceled or restricted. And I want you to have a conversation with your accountant about the $45,000. I asked him why the accountant. Because, he said, gifts given to family members are not always treated the same way under family law, depending on how they were given and documented. And I'd like to understand exactly what financial relationship exists between you and your son's household." I had used the same accountant for 20 years, a meticulous woman named Gloria Martinez, who had done my taxes since I was still at the fire department, and who kept files the way a librarian keeps books, organized, cross-referenced, and permanent. I called her the same afternoon. I told her what had happened. I asked her to pull everything related to the $45,000, bank transfers, correspondence, any documentation of the gift. "Stanley," Gloria said, "this is going to take me a couple of days to put together properly, but I want you to know that what you're describing, restricted access in exchange for money, that raises some red flags for me from a financial perspective." "What kind of red flags?" "The kind that suggests someone might not be handling family money the way they should be. Let me pull the records and we'll see what we're dealing with." What Gloria found was something I hadn't fully processed at the time. The $45,000 I'd given Curtis and Beverly hadn't just gone toward the down payment on the Cranberry Township house. Gloria showed me bank records and a chain of transfers I hadn't seen clearly before. A portion of the money had moved through their joint account and into a separate account in Beverly's name alone, about 18 months after I'd given them the funds. The account had been opened shortly after their home purchase. The transfers were small enough to avoid easy notice. $1,200 here, $800 there, never more than $2,000 at once, but they added up. Roughly $22,000 over the course of about 14 months had been quietly moved into an account Curtis didn't appear to know about. "Look at these dates," Gloria said, pointing to her computer screen. "Every transfer happens right after Curtis' paycheck deposits. She's moving money when the account balance is highest, so it's less likely to be noticed." I sat in Gloria's office for a long time after she told me this. I thought about Curtis' face at the VFW hall, that careful, coached expression. I wondered how much of what he'd been telling me was Beverly's script, and how much of it he genuinely believed. I wondered if he knew about the account. I decided sitting there that he probably didn't. That made it worse somehow, not better. Nelson and Gloria worked together over the following 6 weeks. I didn't say a word to Curtis or Beverly. I kept calling ahead for Saturday visits, kept following the rules, kept arriving on time with my car parked on the street. Beverly let me in for 2-hour windows, and I sat on their beige sectional and watched Tyler do puzzles and told him about the birds at the feeder in my backyard. And I didn't let anything show on my face. It was harder than you might think, sitting in that living room, knowing what I knew. Beverly would bring me coffee in a mug that said, "World's Best Grandpa," a gift Tyler had picked out for me the previous Christmas. She'd ask about my week, comment on the weather, make small talk like we were old friends instead of adversaries in a war. I was still learning how to fight. Tyler asked me once during that period why I looked sad. I told him I wasn't sad. I told him I was just thinking. "About what?" he asked, looking up from his Lego fire station with those gray-blue eyes that reminded me so much of Helen. "About how much I love you," I said. He accepted that with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 6-year-old who has never once doubted that he is loved, and went back to his puzzle. In the 7th week, Nelson told me we had enough. He had drafted a legal demand letter outlining the $45,000 gift, now treated under the circumstances as a documented loan, given the way funds had been redirected, and requesting full repayment. The letter also noted the ongoing pattern of restricted access and formally asserted my rights as a grandparent under Pennsylvania family law, which does allow grandparents to apply to the court for access to a grandchild when that access is being unreasonably denied. The letter was careful and precise and not inflammatory. It was simply very, very clear about what had happened and what the consequences would be if the situation wasn't resolved immediately. Gloria had also prepared a financial summary. Every transfer, every date, the account in Beverly's name, the amounts, a clean documented picture of what had happened to $22,000 of money I'd given to my son's family. She'd even included screenshots of the bank statements, highlighted in yellow to show the pattern of transfers. I put both documents in a large brown envelope. I called Curtis and asked if I could come by that Saturday as usual. He said yes, that was fine. Beverly was making her famous lasagna, and maybe I'd like to stay for dinner. I drove to Cranberry Township with the envelope on the passenger seat. It was a beautiful October afternoon, the kind of day when the leaves are just starting to turn and the air has that crisp edge that promises winter. Any other Saturday, I would have enjoyed the drive, maybe stopped at the apple orchard on Route 228 to pick up cider for Tyler. Beverly answered the door wearing an apron over her jeans, flour in her hair from making homemade pasta. She was in a good mood, chattering about the lasagna and asking if I wanted to see Tyler's latest art project from school. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, which made what I was about to do feel even more surreal. I said I had something for Curtis. She started to say something about how this wasn't a great time. Curtis was watching the Steelers game and didn't like to be interrupted during football, and I said gently that it would only take a moment. I asked her to get him. Curtis came to the door wearing his lucky Steelers jersey, the one he'd had since college. He saw the envelope. Something in his expression shifted. Not guilt, not yet, but a wariness that told me he suspected this wasn't a birthday card. I handed it to him. He opened it there in the doorway, Beverly standing just behind his shoulder, and he read the first document. I watched the color change in his face. Not guilt, not at first. Confusion. He read the second page, with Gloria's financial summary and the highlighted bank statements. Then he looked up at me. "Dad, what is this?" "It's a letter from my lawyer," I said, "and a financial report from my accountant. I think you'll want to read both of them carefully, and then I think you'll want to have a conversation with Beverly." He looked at her. She looked at the envelope like it contained a live snake. "I don't know what he's told you," she started, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "Beverly," I said quietly, "the account is documented. The transfers are documented. All of it. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was very calm, in the way you get calm when you've been sitting with something for 7 weeks and you've decided exactly how you want to handle it. This isn't an attack. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because Curtis deserves to know what's been happening, and because I deserve to see my grandson." She didn't say anything after that. Curtis stood in the doorway reading for a long time. Tyler appeared at his side at some point, slipping under his arm the way children do, and looked up at me. "Hi, Grandpa Stanley," he said. "Hi, buddy," I said. Curtis looked at me over Tyler's head. His expression was something I don't have a clean word for. A combination of embarrassed and betrayed and relieved, all at once. The face of a man who has just been handed the explanation for something that hadn't made sense for years. "Come inside, Dad," he said. "Some fights aren't about winning. They're about teaching the next generation that family love isn't for sale, and that sometimes the people who claim to protect our children are the ones we need to protect them from. The best gift I ever gave my grandson wasn't the $45,000 that started this mess. It was showing him that his grandfather would go to war for him, even when that war was fought with lawyers and bank statements instead of fists."